Beulah Whitmore was left with the land, which was the final and most profound of her late husband's insults. It was not a farm nor even a proper homestead. It was a scar of granite and hard-packed clay in the northern foothills of Montana, a place where the wind came to practice its malice before moving on to torment the more populated valleys to the south. The deed, a brittle piece of paper that felt as fragile as her own future, described the property as 10 acres, but 9 of those acres were a steep, unforgiving hillside that shed shale in the spring and held snow until June. The final acre was a grudgingly flat piece of ground upon which sat a cabin that seemed to be in a constant state of apology for its own existence. The cabin was built of unpeeled logs chinked with mud that had long since dried and crumbled, leaving thin whistling gaps for the wind to sing its lonely dirges through. A single pane of glass served as a window, and on cold mornings the frost etched crystalline ferns across it, beautiful and merciless. The door hung crooked on hand-forged hinges, and the roof was a patchwork of cedar shakes and salvaged tin that rattled in even a modest breeze like the teeth of a nervous animal. Her husband Jasper had bought this place for a song sung by a swindler who was no doubt still laughing somewhere in a warmer climate. Jasper had spoken of potential of carving a life from the raw earth, of building something that would outlast them both, but he had none of the patience or grit that such a carving required. He had the soul of a poet and the hands of a clerk, and the land had broken his spirit long before the fever broke his body. After the creditors had picked over the bones of their shared life in town, taking the furniture, the good china, and even Jasper's beloved collection of books, this worthless plot was all that remained. An inheritance of debt and desolation, a final testament to a life of beautiful, impractical dreams. Beulah had come here not to live, but to disappear, to retreat from the pitying glances and whispered condolences of the town, from the women who touched her arm and said they understood when they did not, from the men who looked past her as if widowhood had made her invisible. She wanted a quiet place to let her grief settle like dust on an abandoned floor. She expected nothing from this land. She asked nothing of it. She simply needed somewhere to be alone with the wreckage of her life. But grief, she was learning, was not a still thing. It did not settle. It moved. It shifted. And in its shifting, it uncovered things she had not expected to find. The memory came on her second night in the cabin, uninvited and sharp as a slap. Not a tender memory, not the kind that warms you. The cruel kind, the kind that draws blood. 3 months before the fever took him, Jasper had used their last savings money. Beulah had earned stitch by stitch from mending clothes and hemming dresses for the women of the town to buy 2 additional acres of land adjacent to this worthless plot. Land that was equally barren, equally useless. He had not asked her. He had not even told her. She had discovered it when the bank sent a letter confirming the transaction addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Jasper Whitmore, as if she had been a willing participant in her own financial ruin. When she confronted him, he had been sitting in their parlor, already thin. From the illness that had not yet been named, his eyes bright with that terrible infectious light of the dreamer. "You will understand someday, Beulah," he had said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man who had never once been right about a practical matter. "This land is bigger than what we can see. There is something in that hill." She had not argued. She had swallowed her anger, as she had done 100 times before, because arguing with Jasper about his dreams was like arguing with the rain about falling. It accomplished nothing and left you exhausted and wet. Now, standing in the cabin he had bought, with a dead man's optimism, she finally allowed herself to be angry. Truly, deeply, poisonously angry. Not the quiet, swallowed anger of a dutiful wife, but the raw, howling anger of a woman who had been left to pay the price for someone else's dreams. He had dreamed for both of them and died, and the bill had come due in her name alone. She pressed her palms against the rough log wall and breathed until the anger became something she could carry, rather than something that carried her. Then she set about the grim business of survival. The autumn of that year was a harbinger, a threat whispered on a wind that carried the scent of iron and ice from the high peaks. The sun was a pale disk in a sky the color of old pewter, offering light but precious little warmth. It crossed the sky in a low apologetic arc, as if embarrassed by its own inadequacy. The days grew short, the shadows grew long. The air acquired an edge that had nothing to do with the wind, a deep cellular coldness that seemed to radiate from the earth itself. The locals in the nearest village, a settlement called Barrow Creek, about a day's walk to the south, spoke of the coming winter in hushed, reverent tones. Old Cyrus Pennell, who had lived in these foothills for 70 years, sat on the porch of the feed store and declared that the caterpillars were the woolliest he had ever seen, that the squirrels were burying their acorns twice as deep, that the bark on the north side of the aspens was thicker than his thumb. All signs pointed to a season of profound and terrible cold. They looked at Beulah, a woman alone in Jasper Whitmore's drafty shack, and their faces were a mixture of pity and the particular morbid curiosity that small towns reserve for impending tragedy. She was a story waiting to happen, a cautionary tale they would tell around their own warm hearths when the blizzards came. Poor Mrs. Whitmore, they would say, shaking their heads. Nobody could have saved her. Her brother-in-law Harmon was the first to come. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, his sturdy wagon pulled by a pair of well-fed draft horses that looked embarrassed to be on such miserable property. Harmon Whitmore was a man built entirely of practicalities, square and solid with a jaw like a brick and hands that could bend a horseshoe or calculate a profit margin with equal facility. He was 15 years older than Jasper had been, and he had spent those 15 years accumulating everything his younger brother had spent his life losing: land, livestock, respect, a farmhouse with a stone chimney that drew perfectly, and a root cellar stocked with enough provisions to see his family through 2 winters, let alone 1. He stood with his hands on his hips, his gaze sweeping over the property with undisguised contempt. He looked at the listing cabin, the weed-choked clearing the looming granite hillside, and his mouth compressed into a thin, bloodless line. "Sell it, Beulah," he said, his voice carrying the flat finality of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I will give you $50 for the granite rights. You cannot live here. This place is not a home. It is a tombstone waiting for a name." Beulah stood in the doorway of the cabin, her arms crossed, and said nothing. Harmon, interpreting her silence as weakness, pressed forward. He had done his research, he said. The granite vein that ran through the hillside was of reasonable quality, and with the new rail line being built to the west, there would be demand for building stone. $50 is generous, he said. You have no capacity to quarry it yourself, and frankly, Beulah, if you cannot demonstrate the ability to manage this property, the county has mechanisms for that. He let the implication hang in the cold air like smoke. She understood him perfectly. A widow without income living alone on unproductive land could be declared incapable of managing her own affairs. A petition to the county judge, a few signatures from concerned citizens, and the property would be placed under guardianship. Harmon's guardianship. Something shifted inside her. Not hope. Something harder and more useful. Stubbornness. It was the last solid thing she owned, the one asset the creditors could not seize, and she gripped it now with both hands. "The land is mine," she said. "The failure is mine. The grief is mine. I will not sell it for the price of a cheap coffin." Harmon changed tactics. His voice softened and he stepped closer, his expression rearranging itself into something meant to resemble compassion. Beulah, I know Jasper was my brother. I do not want to see his widow freeze to death in this shack. Be practical. Jasper was never practical, Beulah replied, and her voice was steady as stone. But at least he never tried to take what belonged to someone else. The softness vanished from Harmon's face as quickly as it had appeared, revealing the granite beneath. He turned on his heel and walked back to his wagon, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. At the wagon, he paused and looked back. The first real freeze will bring you to your senses, he called, or it will kill you. Either way, my offer stands. She watched him go. The wagon grew smaller against the gray landscape until it disappeared behind a stand of bare aspens. His words hung in the air, like the frost itself clinging to the cabin, seeping into the cracks. She went back inside and closed the crooked door against the wind. Althea Kincaid arrived 3 days later, unannounced as was her way. Althea was 68 years old and looked like something carved from the same granite that made up the hillside, weathered and hard and utterly unapologetic about it. She was the nearest neighbor, her small ranch sitting 2 miles to the east, and she had survived 40 Montana winters alone since her husband dropped dead behind his plow in the summer of 1858. Her skin was like tanned leather, her hands more callous than most men's, and her opinions were delivered with the subtlety of a blacksmith's hammer. She came carrying a plucked chicken and a disposition that made it clear the chicken was the friendlier offering. Althea did not sit down. She did not exchange pleasantries. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, rapping her knuckles against the walls, peering up at the roof, stomping her boot against the foundation stones. She conducted her inspection with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a patient she had already mentally pronounced terminal. I have seen 3 people die in cabins like this, Althea said, settling her gaze on Beulah with a frankness that was almost physical. The first one froze. Simple as that. Temperature dropped, fire went out, never woke up. The second one died of smoke. Sealed the cracks too tight, fire ate all the air, filled the room with poison. The third one died of loneliness, just quit, stopped eating, stopped tending the fire, stopped caring. Middle of February, snow higher than your head, nobody comes to check for 6 weeks, that is all it takes. Beulah asked how she had survived. Root cellar, Althea said. Worst nights I go down there with my chickens. The ground does not get cold the way the air does. She said it the way she said everything, as a fact, not an opinion. Beulah asked if Althea would take her in for the winter. Althea shook her head without a flicker of guilt. My place holds one. I have lived alone for 40 years, and I prefer it that way. She set the chicken on the table. But I think you should go to town, not because you are weak, because you are smart enough to know the difference between brave and stupid. If I go to town, Beulah said quietly, Harmon will have this land inside a month. Althea looked at her for a long time. Her eyes, set deep in their weathered sockets, held a complicated light. She understood land. She understood what it meant to fight for it. She had fought that fight herself 40 years ago, when her own brother-in-law had come with his own reasonable arguments and his own offers of help that were really offers to take. Then you need a better plan than stuffing moss into cracks, Althea said. She left the chicken on the table and walked out without saying goodbye. Desperation became Beulah's constant companion after that. It was there in the morning when she woke with her breath pluming in the frigid air and her blanket stiff with frost. It was there at night when the timbers of the cabin groaned under the strain of the wind and the gaps between the logs whistled their thin mocking songs. She was a ship taking on water, and the ocean was infinite and patient. It was during one particularly vicious gust when the wind tore at the cabin with physical violent force that the seed of her salvation was planted. She had been outside fighting to secure a loose piece of roofing tin that was flapping like a broken wing. The gale caught her full in the chest and nearly threw her from her feet. She staggered sideways, arms windmilling, and her boot caught on a root. She went down hard on one knee, the impact sending a bolt of pain up her thigh. Seeking any shelters from the blast, she crawled on hands and knees toward the base of the great granite hillside that loomed over her property like a sleeping god. There, half hidden by a tangle of overgrown hawthorn bushes, she saw it, a dark opening in the earth, the ruin of an old root cellar dug into the hillside by some forgotten predecessor. The door had long ago rotted from its hinges, leaving a gaping mouth in the face of the hill. Driven by instinct, she crawled inside. The effect was instantaneous and astonishing. The roaring of the wind vanished, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses gently against your eardrums and tells you that you have crossed a threshold into a different world. But it was the air itself that stopped her. Outside, the wind was a blade sharp and remorseless, cutting through her clothing and her skin and her resolve. Here, just a few feet into the earth, the air was utterly still. It was cool, yes, but it was a neutral coolness, damp and earthy, devoid of the biting hostility of the surface wind. It did not attack. It simply existed. The difference between a knife and a stone. She took a few more steps into the darkness, her hands trailing along the damp earthen walls. The temperature seemed to hold steady, a constant baseline that was completely unaffected by the chaos just outside. And then she noticed something else. On the far wall, barely visible in the dim light filtering from the entrance, she could see marks in the earth, old chisel marks. Someone years or perhaps decades before her had begun to dig deeper into the hillside and then stopped. The marks were rough and widely spaced, the work of someone who had started with ambition but abandoned the effort. She ran her fingers along the grooves and wondered who they had been and why they had quit. A memory surfaced. Her grandmother, old Nana Bishop, sitting in her kitchen garden in Pennsylvania, her hands buried in the dark soil, speaking in the quiet, certain voice she used for truths she considered too important for emphasis. The earth has a deep breath, child. It breathes out cool in the summer and breathes out warm in the winter. You just have to know how to listen for it. At the time, young Beulah had smiled and nodded and dismissed it as poetry. Old people said poetic things. It was what they did. Now standing in the quiet, stable air of the root cellar, she understood it not as poetry, but as physics. The ground beneath her feet, the great mass of the granite hill beside her, was a thermal reservoir. All through the long Montana summer, the earth absorbed heat from the sun, soaking it deep into its core, storing it in millions of tons of rock and clay and compressed soil. When winter came and the surface world plunged into brutal cold, that stored heat did not vanish. It radiated outward slowly, grudgingly, maintaining a temperature far below the warmth of summer, but far above the killing cold of the surface. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became. A few feet underground, the wild swings between day and night, between sun and storm, between autumn warmth and winter death, were smoothed into a gentle, constant baseline. The earth was not cold, it was patient. An idea began to form in her mind. It was audacious and bizarre and would surely be considered proof of madness by every rational person within 100 miles. But it had a logic to it, a deep structural logic that felt as solid as the granite wall beneath her palm. Everyone, Harmon included, saw the hill as a useless, impassable barrier. They saw the cabin as a flimsy, indefensible shelter. They were trying to fight the winter on its own terms in the open air, where it was strongest. They built thicker walls, they burned more wood, they tried to create tiny bubbles of warmth inside a vast ocean of cold. And every year the cold won. It always won. It had more time, more patience, more resources than any human being could muster. What if they were all wrong? What if the answer was not to build a better fortress against the cold, but to retreat to where the cold could not reach? What if the hill was not a barrier but a shelter? What if she did not have to fight the winter at all? She would not try to insulate the cabin. The cabin was hopeless. Instead, it would become a doorway, a vestibule, an airlock. She would excavate this old root cellar, expanding it, deepening it, carving a living space directly into the heart of the hillside. And she would connect it to the cabin with a stone-lined passage, a tunnel leading from the back wall of her shack directly into the earth. It would be an umbilical cord to the steady, quiet warmth of the deep ground. And in that moment, for the first time since the memory of Jasper's secret land purchase had risen up to poison her, she thought of him without anger. He had stood on this same property, looked at this same hill, and said, "This land is bigger than what we can see. There is something in that hill." He had been wrong about everything practical. He could not swing an axe straight or plant a row of corn that did not wander like a drunkard. But that instinct, that vague dreamer's sense that the hill held hidden value, perhaps it had not been madness after all. Perhaps it had been the one true thing buried in a lifetime of beautiful mistakes. She did not forgive him, not yet. But she stopped being angry, and in that moment, standing in the dark mouth of the hill, that was enough. The next morning, Beulah walked to Barrow Creek. In Emmett Hadley's general store, a place that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and cured meats, she spent nearly all of her remaining money. Not on firewood or thick blankets, but on a new head for a pickaxe, a heavy-duty shovel, 24 candles, and a ball of thick twine. Emmett was 58 years old and had the face of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world was a disappointing place. He watched her purchases assemble on his counter with a frown that deepened with each item. Digging tools, he observed, his voice a low rumble. Hard time of year to be breaking ground. Frost will be setting in soon. "I am not breaking new ground," Beulah replied. "Just improving an old root cellar." He leaned on the counter and studied her. His eyes moved across her face, reading it the way a man of his years reads weather or livestock or the intentions of a stranger. "Look, Beulah," he said, and the use of her first name was deliberate, a signal that he was speaking not as a merchant, but as something closer to a neighbor. "I knew your husband, a dreamer. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. But this place, you cannot win out there. No one can. Come to town. The church has a room for widows. There is no shame in it." "There is no shame in it," she agreed, meeting his eyes. "But I have a home. I just need to make it ready." She paid for her tools and gathered them into her sack. At the door, she paused because Emmett had made a sound, a small, involuntary clearing of his throat that meant he had more to say, but was not sure he should say it. She waited. "You be careful out there," was all he offered, but his eyes said more. She nodded and stepped into the cold. She was not yet out of sight of the store when the door opened again behind her. She did not see Pastor Floyd Stanhope step out from the shadow of the church across the street and walk into the general store. She did not hear the conversation that followed. Stanhope was 50, with silver hair and the composed bearing of a man who believed deeply in order, in propriety, in things being done the way they had always been done. He was not a cruel man, but he was a certain one, and certainty in a small town can be its own kind of cruelty. "Emmett," he said, leaning against the counter where Beulah's coins still sat. "She bought digging tools." Emmett nodded, sweeping the coins into his register. "Harmon came to see me yesterday," Stanhope continued. "He wants me to write a letter to Judge Radcliffe, a statement that Mrs. Whitmore is exhibiting unstable behavior that she may require guardianship. He says she is digging into the hillside like some kind of animal. He is concerned. Emmett said nothing for a moment. He straightened a row of tobacco tins that did not need straightening. Then he looked at the pastor with an expression that was perfectly neutral and completely immovable. "Pastor," he said, "I just sold her those tools. She told me what she was buying. She counted her money correct to the penny. She looked me in the eye and spoke in full sentences. That is not a woman who has lost her mind." Stanhope pursed his lips but did not argue. Emmett Hadley was not a man whose word could be easily dismissed. He was the kind of man whose testimony carried weight precisely because he so rarely offered it. "I am not saying she has lost her mind," Stanhope said carefully. "I am saying that a woman alone digging holes in a hillside as winter approaches is a woman who may need guidance." Might be Emmett allowed. Might also be she knows something we do not. He turned away to restock a shelf, and the conversation was over. Beulah knew nothing of this exchange. She knew only the weight of the tools in her sack, the cold air in her lungs, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. The walk back was long, and the light was already beginning to fail by the time her cabin came into view, small and crooked against the massive dark shoulder of the hill. She set her sack on the floor, ate a cold supper of bread and dried meat, and sharpened the pickaxe head by the light of a candle. The steel sang against the whetstone a thin rising note that sounded like a question being asked over and over. In the morning, she carried her tools to the mouth of the old root cellar. She stood for a moment looking into the darkness. The air drifted out cool and steady, and she breathed it in. Then she swung the pickaxe. The first blow sent a shock up her arms and into her shoulders that made her gasp. The steel bit into the compacted earth and struck a seam of rock that rang like a dull bell. A chip of stone flew past her ear. Her wrists ached. Her shoulders protested. The second blow was easier than the first, not because the earth had softened, but because she had learned from the pain exactly where the resistance lived and adjusted her angle. The third blow was easier still. She was not strong. She had never been strong, but she had something that was in this particular fight more useful than strength. She had nothing else to do. No other option, no fallback plan, no safety net. There was only the hill and the cold that was coming and the absolute necessity of being ready when it arrived. She swung again and again, and the rhythmic chip of steel on earth and stone began to echo from the hillside, a sound that would carry on the wind all the way to the edges of the town, where it would enter the ears of hunters and trappers and children and become the seed of a legend that none of them yet understood. The rumors reached the village before the first snow. Hunters returning from the high country told stories at the bar of the Barrow Creek Saloon about a sound they could not explain, a rhythmic metallic ringing that echoed from the hillside on Jasper Whitmore's old worthless plot, steady as a heartbeat, starting at first light and continuing until dark. They said it was the widow. They said she was digging, always digging. One hunter claimed he had crept close enough to see the entrance to some kind of hole in the hillside with piles of excavated rock stacked around it like the tailings of a mine. Children in the schoolyard began whispering about the mole woman, daring each other to sneak out to the property and peer into the darkness. Inside that darkness, Beulah was learning a new language. The first weeks of excavation had been a brutal education in suffering. Every muscle in her body staged its own private rebellion. Her shoulders burned from the overhead swing of the pickaxe. Her lower back seized in spasms that left her lying flat on the cold ground, staring at the earthen ceiling, waiting for the pain to release its grip. Her hands had gone through a transformation that felt almost alchemical. the soft skin of her palms first blistering into raw weeping wounds, then hardening into thick yellow calluses that split at the edges and bled into the cracks. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old petticoat and kept working. But the earth was teaching her, and she was proving to be an able student. She discovered that the granite in the hillside was not a single monolithic mass, but a fractured mosaic of interlocking blocks, separated by hairline fissures that ran through the rock like the veins in a leaf. If she struck, the solid facehead on the pickaxe bounced back, and the shock traveled up her arms with punishing force, accomplishing nothing. But if she studied the rock first, traced the fissures with her fingertips, found the points where 2 or 3 cracks converged, she could place her chisel at the intersection and strike it once cleanly, and the stone would separate along its natural lines with a sound like a book being opened. She learned to use the cold itself as a tool. In the evenings, she would pour water from her bucket into the promising cracks she had identified during the day. Overnight, the water froze and expanded, widening the fissures by fractions of an inch. In the morning, a single well-placed blow could split a section of rock that would have taken her an hour of brute labor to break through. The cold was her enemy on the surface, but down here in the dark, she was learning to make it work for her. The drainage problem had nearly defeated her before she solved it. Water seeped from the rock walls in thin, persistent trickles that collected on the floor of the expanding chamber and turned the workspace into a muddy, treacherous mess. Her boots squelched with every step, and the dampness crept into everything: her clothes, her blankets, her spirits. She spent 2 full days digging a narrow channel along the base of the far wall, angled slightly downward toward the entrance, and lined it with small river stones she carried in her pockets from the creek bed a quarter-mile away. The channel worked. The water followed the path she had made for it, trickling quietly toward the opening, and the floor began to dry. It was during the 3rd week that Beulah Whitmore appeared. She heard him before she saw him. A scuffing of boots at the entrance, a shadow falling across the wedge of daylight that served as her only natural illumination. She gripped the pickaxe and pressed herself against the wall, her heart slamming. Harmon. It had to be Harmon, come to drag her out, come with papers or a sheriff or whatever instrument of authority he had assembled. But the figure that ducked into the entrance was too small and too hesitant. A boy 14 years old with Harmon's broad shoulders, but none of Harmon's certainty. Beulah Whitmore stood blinking in the dim light, his mouth slightly open, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He was dressed in work clothes that were too large for him, hand-me-downs from his father, and his boots were caked with mud from the long walk. He did not look at her. He looked at the walls. He reached out and touched the exposed granite, running his palm along the surface the way a person touches something they are trying to believe is real. "It is not cold in here," he said. "Not a question, a discovery." Beulah watched him from the shadows, still holding the pickaxe, still not sure if he was a threat or a scout or simply a curious boy. "What are you doing here, Nolan?" "Pa says you are crazy," the boy said, still examining the wall. His fingers found the chisel marks and traced them. "He says it every night at supper. The crazy woman digging her own grave." "And what do you think?" Nolan finally looked at her. His eyes were serious, older than 14. "I think you are building something." He glanced at the wooden bucket filled with excavated rubble. "You want me to haul that out for you?" He did not ask why she was doing it. He did not need a plan or an explanation or a justification. He saw work that needed doing and offered his hands. It was the most practical thing anyone had said to Beulah since she had arrived on this property, and it came from a child. She lowered the pickaxe. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Nolan began coming 3 or 4 times a week after that, always in the afternoon, always alone, always without announcement. He would appear at the entrance, pick up the bucket or the shovel, and work alongside her in near silence. He was strong for his age, and he had the endurance of youth, the ability to perform repetitive physical labor without the creeping despair that made the same work so punishing for an adult mind. He hauled rubble. He carried flat stones from the shale deposits on the upper hillside and stacked them inside the chamber for her to use as wall lining. He held the candle while she chiseled, steady as a lamppost, never flinching when chips of rock flew past his face. They developed a wordless rhythm, an understanding built not on conversation but on shared labor. Inside the growing chamber, with the earth close around them and the sound of the outside world reduced to a distant murmur, the complications of the surface, Harmon's fury, the town's judgment, the suffocating weight of expectation and propriety, all of it fell away. There was only the work. Occasionally, Nolan would talk, not about his father, not about the whispers in town. He talked about school, about a teacher who had lent him a book on geology, about a fox den he had found near the creek. Beulah listened and said little. She understood that the boy was not looking for a conversation. He was looking for a place where he was not being measured against his father's standards and found wanting. She understood that perfectly. It was the last Tuesday of October when the arrangement collapsed. Harmon arrived without warning, as was his habit. Beulah heard the wagon before she saw it and climbed out of the tunnel entrance to meet him, hoping to keep him away from the hillside. But she was too slow. Harmon was already striding toward the excavation site, his face dark with purpose. He had heard something, she realized. Someone in town had seen Nolan heading in this direction. He stopped at the entrance to the chamber and stared at the opening, at the piles of excavated rock, at the tools leaning against the hillside. His face went through a rapid sequence of expressions. Disbelief, then disgust, then something closer to fear. The hole was larger than he had expected. Much larger. This was not the idle scratching of a deranged woman. This was engineering. Before he could speak, Nolan emerged from the tunnel. The boy was bent under the weight of a full bucket of rubble, his face streaked with dust, his shirt dark with sweat. He straightened up, saw his father, and froze. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. It was the longest 5 seconds of all 3 of their lives. Harmon's voice, when it came, was barely controlled. "Put that down." Nolan set the bucket on the ground. "Come here." Nolan walked to his father. His steps were steady, but Beulah could see his hands trembling at his sides. Harmon seized the front of the boy's shirt, pulling him close. "How long?" he demanded. "How long have you been coming here?" 3 weeks, Nolan said. He did not look away from his father's eyes. "I came on my own. She did not ask me." Harmon released him with a shove that sent the boy stumbling backward. Then he turned on Beulah, and his face was a thing she had never seen before, rage uncut by calculation, pure and scalding. "You brought my son into this," he breathed, "into this hole, this madness." "He came on his own," Beulah said, keeping her voice level, keeping her hands visible and still. "And he has done more honest work here in 3 weeks than you have acknowledged in his entire life." The words landed exactly where she had aimed them, and the effect was immediate. Harmon's hand came up fast and struck Nolan across the face. Not with his fist, with his open palm, but the sound of it cracked across the clearing like a gunshot. Nolan's head snapped to the side. He did not cry out. He pressed his hand to his cheek and stood perfectly still, his eyes on the ground. Beulah stepped forward. Her voice dropped to a register that Harmon had never heard from her, low and flat, and carrying a weight of authority that had nothing to do with social standing and everything to do with a woman who had spent weeks swinging a pickaxe into granite. "You hit your son in front of me one more time," she said, "and I will walk into town and tell every person in Barrow Creek exactly what I saw." starting with your wife." Harmon's hand dropped. His breath came in short, hard bursts. He looked from Beulah to Nolan and back, and what he saw in both their faces, the absolute absence of submission, seemed to disorient him more than anything else. "You have poisoned him," Harmon said, his voice shaking. "You and your insane project. I am going to Judge Radcliffe. A woman digging tunnels and luring children underground, that is enough evidence for any court in this territory." He grabbed Nolan by the arm and dragged him toward the wagon. At the wagon, Nolan wrenched his arm free and climbed up on his own. He looked back at Beulah once. His cheek was red where his father's hand had landed, but his eyes were dry and steady. He did not wave. He simply looked, and in that look was a promise that Harmon could not see and would not have understood. Beulah watched the wagon disappear. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. She picked up the pickaxe, descended into the tunnel, and began to work. Each strike of the steel carried a new energy, something hotter and more focused than the grim determination that had fueled her before. Anger, she was discovering, was an excellent source of fuel so long as you had something to swing it at. Emmett gave her the news on her next trip to the store, speaking in the low, unhurried voice of a man delivering information he wished he did not have. "Harmon is collecting signatures," he said, wrapping a block of cheese in brown paper without looking up. "He has 7, needs 10 to file the petition with Judge Radcliffe." A pause. "I did not sign." He pushed a heavy canvas bag across the counter. Inside were a dozen thick iron spikes. "Free of charge," he said. "Use them to anchor your stonework. Drive them into the gaps between the big pieces. Mortar will not set properly in this cold, but iron and gravity will hold." He met her eyes then briefly. Kincaid would not sign either. That was all he said. No speech, no declaration of support, no stirring words of encouragement. He was not built for such things. But in those few sentences, he had told her 2 critical facts. First, that she was running out of time, and second, that she was not entirely alone. She drove the spikes exactly as he suggested, hammering them deep into the crevices between the larger stones, and the effect was remarkable. The walls of the passage gained a solidity that mortar alone could never have provided, each spike acting as a pin that locked the stones into the earth and into each other. It was Pastor Stanhope who came next, and he did not come alone. He arrived on a gray morning in early November, accompanied by Artis Radcliffe, wife of Judge Radcliffe, and a woman whose opinion carried the specific gravity of law in Barrow Creek. Mrs. Radcliffe was 55, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, even for a visit to the wilderness, and she regarded the world through a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles that made her look like a school teacher evaluating a student she had already decided to fail. Stanhope was solicitous, gentle. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to delivering difficult truths in soft packaging. "Beulah, the community is concerned for you. Harmon has presented his case to me, and I felt it was only responsible to come and see for myself. Mrs. Radcliffe has kindly agreed to accompany me to provide an independent perspective." Beulah understood the machinery at work. This was not a social call. This was an assessment. Harmon's petition needed credibility, and the word of the pastor and the judge's wife would provide it. If they returned to town and reported that Beulah Whitmore was living in a hole in the ground, exhibiting signs of mental deterioration, the petition would sail through Judge Radcliffe's office without resistance. She considered her options. She could refuse them entry. She could argue protests cite her legal rights. But she had learned something about persuasion from her weeks underground. Sometimes the most powerful argument is not words. It is evidence. "Come," she said, "let me show you." She led them around to the entrance of the chamber. Stanhope peered into the darkness and drew back. Mrs. Radcliffe stood rigid, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. "Mrs. Radcliffe," Beulah said. I am asking you to step inside, just 5 steps. Then you can make your judgment. Mrs. Radcliffe looked at Stanhope. Stanhope looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Radcliffe, who had not survived 30 years as a judge's wife by deferring to uncomfortable men, squared her shoulders and ducked through the entrance. She took 5 steps into the chamber and stopped. Beulah watched the woman's face. She saw the exact moment it happened, the slight parting of the lips, the almost imperceptible widening of the eyes behind those steel spectacles. Mrs. Radcliffe felt the air change. She felt the wind die. She felt the temperature settle into something that was not warm but was emphatically not hostile. Her breath, which had been pluming in white clouds outside, became invisible. She stood motionless for 10 full seconds. Then she turned and walked out without a word. Outside, Stanhope was waiting with an expression of anxious expectation. Well, Mrs. Radcliffe removed her spectacles, polished them slowly on her handkerchief, and replaced them. I will tell my husband that Mrs. Whitmore is eccentric, she said, but lucid. She paused. And that she is building something I do not have a word for. But the air in there it is different, Daniel. It is not what I expected. Stanhope opened his mouth to argue, but the judge's wife was already walking back toward the wagon, and he was not fool enough to contradict her. He gave Beulah a long, complicated look, part frustration, part something that might have been reluctant curiosity, and followed. Beulah stood at the entrance to her tunnel and watched them leave. Her knees were trembling, but her face was still. She had won this battle, but she knew Harmon had not yet spent all his ammunition. Althea Kincaid came for the 3rd time on a day when the sky was the color of iron, and the temperature had dropped low enough to freeze the mud into something that crunched underfoot like broken crockery. She did not bring food this time. She did not bring advice. She came with empty hands and stood at the entrance to the chamber, now significantly larger than it had been during her last visit, and looked at Beulah with an expression the younger woman had never seen on that weathered face. It was not approval. Althea Kincaid did not traffic in approval. It was something more valuable. It was reassessment. Althea stepped inside. She walked the full perimeter of the chamber, running her hands along the stone-lined walls. She examined the iron spikes driven into the joints. She looked up at the ceiling where Beulah had fitted flat stones in an interlocking pattern that distributed weight evenly across the span. She knelt and inspected the drainage channel along the far wall. How are you managing the runoff from snowmelt? She asked. It was a technical question. The question of a woman evaluating a structure, not a sanity. Beulah showed her the channel lined with river stones angled toward the entrance. Althea nodded slowly. Smart, but you need to line it with smaller gravel as well. Just the big stones will clog when the fine silt comes in with the spring melt. Pack the gaps with pea gravel. It will filter the water and keep the channel open. It was the first piece of construction advice Althea had ever offered. There was no preamble, no declaration of support, no dramatic moment of conversion. One visit she had told Beulah she would die here. Now she was discussing gravel specifications. The distance between those two positions was vast, and Althea had crossed it in her own time at her own pace on the evidence of her own eyes and hands. Beulah felt the back of her throat tighten. Thank you, Althea. Althea waved the gratitude away as if it were a fleet. Do not thank me. Fix the drainage. Now came the most dangerous phase. Beulah had her chamber a room roughly 10 feet square, its ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright, its walls lined with fitted stone, its floor dry and solid. But it was still disconnected from the cabin. To reach it, she had to walk outside around the back of the property and enter through the hillside opening, a journey that was merely unpleasant now, but would be suicidal in a blizzard. She needed the passage. She needed to breach the back wall of the cabin and dig a horizontal tunnel through the 10 feet of earth that separated it from the chamber. It was the spine of her entire plan, and it was the part most likely to kill her. She used Jasper's old logging saw to cut a low-arched opening in the logs of the cabin's back wall just above the crude stone foundation. Then from inside the cabin, she began to dig inward. It was claustrophobic, terrifying work. She could not swing the pickaxe in the confined space, so she used a hand chisel and a small sledgehammer, chipping away at the earth inches at a time. She worked on her hands and knees, her face pressed close to the excavation, face the candle guttering behind her in the draft. The smell of damp earth filled her nostrils and her lungs and her dreams. She shored up the tunnel as she went, fitting flat stones into the walls and ceiling, with obsessive care, wedging iron spikes into the keys, testing each section by pressing her full weight against it before advancing further. The work was agonizingly slow. Some days she advanced 6 inches, some days she advanced 2. 3 times sections of the tunnel roof collapsed. Small collapses, handfuls of earth and pebbles showering down on her head and shoulders. But each one sent her scrambling backward on her belly, heart hammering, dust in her eyes, certain that the next second would bring the full weight of the earth down on her, and that would be the end. Each time she lay into the cabin, breathing until her hands stopped shaking, then crawled back in and rebuilt the damaged section with more care than before. The third collapse was the worst. It happened at night by candlelight, when she was further from the cabin entrance than she had ever been. A section of ceiling the size of a dinner table let go all at once, and the weight of it drove her flat against the tunnel floor. For a moment she could not move. Earth pressed against her back, her legs the side of her face. The candle had gone out. The darkness was absolute. She lay there and listened to her own breathing. It sounded very loud and very small at the same time. She thought about the 3 people Althea had described. The one who froze, the one who suffocated, the one who simply quit. She wondered which one she would be. Then she moved her right hand, just her hand pushing earth away from her fingers 1 grain at a time. Then her forearm, then her elbow. She pulled herself forward inch by inch until her head emerged from the debris and she could feel the open air of the tunnel behind her. She crawled backward into the cabin, filthy and trembling, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall. She looked at her hands, cracked, bleeding, black with earth. She looked at the dark mouth of the tunnel. She thought about the church room for widows. She thought about Harmon's $50. She thought about being warm and safe and finished with all of this. She pulled the blanket over herself and lay down. Tomorrow she would walk to town. Tomorrow she would accept defeat. She woke at some black hour of the night, shivering violently. The fire had died. The cabin was a bath of frozen air. Her teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue and tasted copper. She rolled onto her stomach and began to crawl, not toward the door, not toward the stove, but toward the tunnel, toward the only direction that had ever offered her anything. She crawled 3 feet into the unfinished passage, just far enough to get her body below the surface line, and she felt it. Not warmth, but the absence of assault. The air did not bite. The wind did not exist. Her shivering slowed. Her jaw unclenched. Her body understood before her mind did. She crawled back out, found the candle, found the matches, lit the wick. Then she picked up the chisel and the hammer and crawled back into the tunnel. At 3 in the morning, alone by candlelight in the dark, she began to dig. She broke through on a Thursday. The chisel punched through the last inches of compacted earth and met open air, and she felt the gentle draft from the chamber beyond flow over her knuckles like breath. She widened the hole with shaking hands until it was large enough to crawl through, and she emerged from the tunnel into the larger darkness of her underground room. She did not cheer. She did not laugh. She sat on the stone floor of the chamber and cried a single wrenching sob that came from somewhere deeper than her chest, from somewhere in the bedrock of her being. The passage was complete. In the days that followed, she moved with the focused urgency of a woman who could hear the clock ticking. She disassembled the cabin's small pot-bellied stove, a monstrously heavy and awkward task, and moved it piece by piece through the passage into the chamber. She assembled a long chimney from sections of stovepipe that Emmett had sold her at a steep discount, running it from the stove up through a narrow vent she had chipped through the ceiling of the chamber, and then up the surface of the steep hillside, anchoring it to the granite face with iron spikes. It was an ugly, crooked thing that looked like it had been assembled by a lunatic. It drew perfectly. A small fire in the stove would pull fresh air from the cabin through the passage and into the chamber, preventing the atmosphere from growing stale. She tested it with a candle held at the tunnel entrance and watched the flame lean steadily toward the chamber, confirming the airflow. By the first week of December, she was finished. She moved her few belongings into the chamber: blankets, food, candles, a handful of books. She sealed the cabin's front door from the inside, packing the cracks with rags and old newspaper. The cabin was now a buffer zone, a decompression chamber between the killing cold of the surface and the steady, livable air of the underground. Nolan came one last time. He appeared at the tunnel entrance on a late afternoon when the light was already failing and the air had a new quality to it, a metallic stillness that meant snow was imminent and serious. He was breathing hard from running. He did not come inside. He held out a small package wrapped in newspaper. "For you," he said. "I found it in the barn, in a box of Granddad's things." Inside the newspaper was a leather journal and cracked, its pages yellowed and brittle. Beulah opened it carefully. The handwriting was cramped and faded but legible. The name on the inside cover was Orville Whitmore, Harmon and Jasper's grandfather. She turned the pages and found sketches, rough, practical drawings of the Hillside property, measurements, notations in a steady hand, and on one page a drawing of the root cellar with an arrow pointing deeper into the hillside and a single word written beside it in capital letters: warm. Orville Whitmore had known. 50 years ago, the old man had dug. That cellar felt the stable temperature of the deep earth and understood its potential. He had begun to expand it. Those old chisel marks Beulah had found on her first day were his. But something had stopped him. Illness, age, the demands of the ranch. She would never know. He had written his discovery in this journal, and the journal had sat in a box in Harmon's barn for half a century, unread, forgotten, dismissed. 3 generations. Orville had started it. Jasper had sensed it without understanding it. Beulah had finished it, and Harmon, the practical one, the successful one, the one who understood the world in terms of profit and loss, was the only member of the family who had never listened to the hill. Nolan shifted his weight in the doorway. "Pa does not know I took it," he said. "I have to go." He turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk before she could find words. She stood holding the journal, the leather warm from the boy's pocket, and felt something rise in her chest that she could not name. Not gratitude exactly, something larger and more fragile. That night, the radio at Emmett Hadley's store crackled with the forecast. A Siberian Express, the announcer called it, a mass of Arctic air descending from Canada, carrying with it temperatures that had not been recorded in Montana in living memory. The storm of the century. In the village, the word spread fast. Men began splitting wood with a desperate rhythmic fury. Women emptied their pantries into canning jars. The schoolhouse closed. The church opened its doors for prayer. Beulah sat in her chamber 10 feet below the frozen surface of the earth, reading Orville Whitmore's journal by candlelight, and waited for the storm to come. The blizzard arrived on the winter solstice, and it did not arrive gently. It came from the north in a wall of white, so dense that it erased the distinction between earth and sky. One moment the distant peaks of the Bitterroot Range were visible against the horizon, sharp and blue and ancient. The next moment they were gone, swallowed whole, as if the mountains themselves had been a rumor that the storm had decided to correct. The wind did not build gradually. It announced itself with a single explosive gust that tore a shutter from the schoolhouse in Barrow Creek and sent it cartwheeling down Main Street, and from that moment forward, the wind did not stop. For 2 days before the storm made landfall, the village had been a hive of frantic, almost feverish activity. Men who had been splitting wood at a steady pace all autumn now attacked their wood piles with a wooled, rhythmless urgency. Women sealed windows with oiled paper and flour paste. The general store was stripped of candles, lamp oil, salt pork, and dried beans in a single afternoon. Emmett Hadley stood behind his empty shelves and watched his neighbors carry their purchases out into a wind that was already beginning to moan, and his face held the expression of a man watching people board up their houses against a flood he suspected would be higher than any of them imagined. The radio in his store, a battered Crosley that picked up the signal from Helena on clear days, had been repeating the same bulletin since dawn. Record cold. Historic accumulation. Stay indoors. Do not travel. The announcer's voice carried the particular flatness of a man trying very hard not to sound afraid. In his large, well-built farmhouse 3 miles south of Beulah's property, Harmon Whitmore was making his own preparations. He had 4 cords of seasoned oak stacked against the north wall. He had a stone chimney that he had built with his own hands, mortared and capped and drawing clean. He had a root cellar stocked with potatoes, turnips, canned tomatoes, and salt beef. He had a house with walls 14 inches thick and a roof that had never leaked. He had done everything right. He had prepared the way a practical man prepares, with materials and labor and forethought, and he stood at his window watching the sky darken and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who has built his fortress well. Verna stood behind him, their youngest boy on her hip, coughing into her shoulder. The older girl was setting the table. Nolan was in the corner reading. He had not spoken much since the incident at Beulah's property. He did what his father told him and said nothing more. Harmon watched the first flakes fall, fat and slow, deceptively gentle. By nightfall they would be small and hard and horizontal, driven by a wind that would not relent for 3 days. He did not think about Beulah. He had decided not to think about her. The storm hit the town like a fist. Within hours, the gentle snowfall had become a horizontal torrent of ice crystals that stripped the bark from exposed trees and sandblasted the paint from the south-facing walls of every building in Barrow Creek. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero at dusk, plunged through the floor of the thermometer and kept falling. 20 below, 30, 35. Numbers that stopped meaning anything to the human body, because at those depths, exposed flesh does not distinguish between cold and fire. It simply dies. In the houses of the village, families discovered the difference between ordinary winter and something else entirely. The cold found every weakness, every gap, every shortcut taken during construction. It forced itself through window frames that had held for 20 years. It crawled under doors that had always sealed tight. It turned the moisture on interior nail heads into tiny pearls of ice that grew slowly and steadily into miniature stalactites. Pipes froze and burst with sounds like pistol shots, sending water cascading across kitchen floors, where it froze into sheets of ice within minutes. Chimneys that had always drawn well began to back up as wind-driven snow clogged their openings, filling rooms with smoke that sent families scrambling for air. In the Whitmore farmhouse, the catastrophe came on the second night. Harmon was adding wood to the main fireplace, a ritual he had performed every 2 hours since the storm began, when he heard a sound that turned his blood to something colder than the air outside. A deep grinding crack followed by a low rumble, followed by the unmistakable percussion of masonry collapsing. A section of his stone chimney, the chimney he had built himself, mortared with his own hands, the chimney he would have bet his life on, had fractured under the relentless assault of the wind. Stones and mortar and 50 years of accumulated soot cascaded onto the hearth, sending a choking cloud of black dust billowing into the main room, followed immediately by a blast of Arctic air that hit the family like a physical blow. Verna screamed. The youngest boy began to wail. The older girl pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes wide and white. Nolan was already on his feet, moving toward the kitchen door. Harmon stood in front of his ruined fireplace, his hands hanging at his sides, and for 5 full seconds he did not move. He stared at the rubble on his hearth, at the jagged black hole where his chimney had been, at the snow already beginning to drive through the opening, and he could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. He had built this chimney. He had built it right. He had done everything right, and it had failed. They retreated to the kitchen. The cook stove was smaller, fed by a separate flue, and it was still functioning. Harmon sealed the door to the main room with blankets and towels, but the coal was already inside the house, spreading through the walls like a living thing, claiming room after room. They huddled around the cook stove, all 5 of them feeding it wood at a rate that Harmon calculated with growing dread. At this pace, their 4 cords would last 5 days. The storm showed no sign of stopping. By the 3rd day, the youngest boy's cough had deepened into something wet and rattling. Verna held him against her chest, her face gray with exhaustion and fear. Frost was climbing the interior walls of the kitchen. The temperature inside the room, their last room, had dropped below 40. Harmon had burned through more than half their wood. On the 4th morning, the wind eased slightly, but the cold intensified as if the storm had decided to trade fury for precision. The thermometer on the porch, visible through the kitchen window, read 42 degrees below zero. The air outside was not air in any meaningful sense. It was a medium hostile to life, as inhospitable as the vacuum of space. In everything it touched, it killed. Harmon sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, listening to his son cough, and thought about his options. His nearest neighbor, the Patterson farm, was a mile to the south, but the road was buried under drifts that could swallow a man standing upright. He could not reach them. He could not reach town. The wood was running out. And then the thought came, the one he had been refusing to let in for 3 days. Beulah. Her cabin was closer than the Pattersons, half a mile to the north. He pictured it buried under snow. The tin roof collapsed, the logs split by the cold. He pictured her inside, frozen, curled up under her threadbare blankets, the tragic self-inflicted end he had predicted. A part of him, the part he was least proud of, felt a grim flicker of vindication. He had warned her. He had offered her a way out. She had refused. But another part of him, the part that was watching his youngest son struggle to breathe, thought only of shelter. Her cabin was close. Perhaps it was still standing. Perhaps there was wood left. Perhaps there was something, anything that could buy them one more day. It was Verna who spoke first. She had been silent for 3 days, conserving her energy for the children. But now she looked at Harmon with eyes that held nothing of the deference he was accustomed to seeing there. "Harmon," she said, and her voice was not a request. "Beulah's cabin is closest." "She is dead," Harmon said. "The cabin is buried." Nolan looked up from the corner where he had been sitting, his arms wrapped around his knees. She is not dead, Pa. His voice was quiet but certain. She has the chamber under the hill. I told you. It is warm down there. I have been inside it. Harmon stared at his son. The boy's words did not make sense. None of this made sense. A chamber under the hill, warmth underground, the ravings of a woman who had lost her mind and the boy she had corrupted. Harmon, Verna's voice again harder now. Our son is sick. The wood is almost gone. Whatever is out there, whatever she built it, is closer than anything else. Go. There are moments in a man's life when the entire structure of his self-understanding is tested not by a dramatic confrontation or a philosophical crisis, but by a simple, impossible choice between his pride and his family's survival. Harmon Whitmore sat in his freezing kitchen and felt the full weight of that choice settle on his shoulders. He stood up. He put on every layer of clothing he owned: 2 pairs of wool socks, long underwear, 2 flannel shirts, a canvas coat lined with sheepskin, a scarf wound 3 times around his face, leather gloves inside canvas mittens. He looked less like a man than like a bundle of fabric with legs. Nolan was already dressed. I know the way, the boy said. Harmon did not argue. He did not have the energy for it, and somewhere beneath his exhaustion, in a place he would not examine until much later, he understood that his son had earned the right to lead. They stepped outside and the cold hit them with the force of something solid. Harmon's first breath seared his lungs and froze the moisture in his nostrils into a crust of ice. The world was white and featureless, a blank page upon which nothing was written. The snow was waist-deep and crusted on top, which meant that every step required lifting his boot above the surface and then plunging it back down, an exhausting mechanical motion that consumed energy at an appalling rate. Nolan moved ahead, smaller and lighter, finding the firmest ground by instinct. He did not look back to see if his father was following. He simply moved steadily northward toward the hill. It took them nearly 2 hours to cover half a mile. When they crested the last rise and looked down into the clearing where Beulah's cabin stood, Harmon saw what he expected to see: desolation. The cabin was nearly invisible, a shapeless mound of white, with only one corner of the roof protruding a dark triangle against the snow. There was no smoke, no light, no indication that any living thing had been here since autumn. Harmon sank to his knees in the snow. His legs had no more to give. His face was raw, his eyelashes crusted with ice, his fingers numb inside their double layers of protection. She is dead, he whispered. We came for nothing. Nolan did not stop. He pushed past his father and waded around the side of the buried cabin toward the back, toward the hillside. Harmon watched him go with the dull incomprehension of a man whose mind has been slowed to a crawl by cold and despair. Then he heard Nolan's voice, thin and distant against the wind. Here, Pa, here. Harmon forced himself upright. He staggered after his son around the cabin, and there against the hillside he saw 2 things that did not belong to the landscape of death he had expected. The first was a dark, arched opening at the base of the hill, partially sheltered from the drifting snow by an overhang of granite, a tunnel entrance. The second was a thin, crooked line of black pipe rising from the snow on the hillside above, and from its mouth, barely visible against the white ski, a faint shimmer of heat. Smoke! Something was alive inside the hill. Nolan was already on his knees, crawling into the opening. Harmon stood for a moment, swaying, staring at the impossible dark mouth in the hillside. It looked like the entrance to a den, to something animal and primitive and utterly at odds with everything he understood about how human beings were supposed to live. He got on his knees and followed his son into the earth. The transition was immediate. The wind stopped as if a door had been closed on it. The howling that had filled his ears for 4 days ceased, replaced by a silence so complete that he could hear the blood moving through his own veins. The air that touched his face was not warm, but it had no teeth. His lungs opened. He had not realized he had been breathing in shallow, panicked sips for days until this moment when the air allowed him to take a full, deep, unrestricted breath. He crawled forward through the passage, his hands finding smooth-fitted stone beneath his palms. The passage was solid, engineered, every stone placed with intention. He could feel a faint current of warmer air flowing toward him, and he followed it the way a drowning man follows the surface. The passage opened into a larger space, and there, in the soft amber glow of candlelight and the red warmth of a small iron stove, sat Beulah Whitmore. She was in a simple wooden chair. A thick blanket lay across her lap. A book rested in her hands, open, held at an angle that caught the light. She looked up as the two figures emerged from the tunnel, one small and familiar, one large and encrusted with ice, and her expression was not surprise. It was the look of someone who has been expecting a knock on the door and has been waiting patiently to answer it. Harmon could only stand in the entrance and stare. He was a creature of the frozen surface, ice in his beard, frost on his eyelashes, his face raw and cracked and barely recognizable as human. She was sitting in a room that was warmer than his own kitchen had been before the chimney fell. A small pot of something that smelled of onions and salt beef simmered on the stove. The walls were solid stone, fitted and spiked and immovable. The ceiling was low but secure. A stack of firewood, neatly cut and carefully dried, sat against the far wall. It was larger than what he had left at his own house. He looked from the wood to the walls to the stove to the book in her hands, and he felt something inside him collapse. Not a chimney this time, something older and more structural. An entire architecture of belief, of certainty, of knowing who was wise and who was foolish, who was strong and who was weak. How the word came out of his ruined throat in a croak barely audible. Beulah closed the book and marked her page with a finger. "The hill is warmer than the wind, Harmon. I just decided to live in the hill." He did not fall immediately. He stood swaying in the entrance of the chamber, his eyes moving slowly across the walls, and what he was seeing, Beulah understood, was not just stone. He was seeing labor, hundreds of hours of it. Every chisel mark, every fitted stone, every driven spike represented a day of work performed by a woman he had called insane, performed alone in the dark with her bare hands. He was a farmer. He understood what it meant to build something with your body, and he was looking at a monument to physical labor that dwarfed anything he had ever attempted. His knees buckled. He went down slowly, almost gracefully, like a tree that has finally been cut through. He sat on the stone floor and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. The sound he made was not loud. It was a small, private, devastating sound. The sound of a man who has spent his entire adult life being certain and has just discovered in the most visceral way possible that certainty was the most expensive mistake he ever made. Nolan sat near the stove, warming his hands, watching his father. His face held no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet, sad tenderness that was far too old for 14. Beulah let Harmon cry. She did not touch him. She did not comfort him. She had no comfort to offer him, and he had not yet earned the kind that required contact. She waited, and when his breathing steadied, she poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup and placed it on the floor beside him. "How many at home?" she asked. Harmon wiped his face with the back of his glove. "Verna, 2 children. The youngest is sick, coughing." "Then you need to bring them here." He looked up at her. His eyes were red and swollen and stripped of every pretense he had ever worn. "There is room. It will be tight, But tight and warm is better than spacious and dead. Harmon drank the water. He sat for 10 minutes, letting the warmth of the chamber seep into his frozen joints. Then he stood, and without a word, he and Nolan crawled back into the passage and out into the white fury of the storm. The return journey, burdened with Verna and two small children, was the hardest physical ordeal of Harmon's life. Verna carried the youngest boy inside her coat, pressed against her body heat. Harmon carried the older girl on his back. Nolan broke trail ahead of them, a small, determined figure, cutting through the drifts with the steady persistence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. They reached the hillside in the last gray light of the afternoon. Nolan guided his mother into the tunnel entrance, then came back for the older girl. Harmon went last, herding his family into the earth, into the darkness, into the place he had called a grave. They emerged into the chamber, and the warmth received them. There was a seventh person there when they arrived. Althea Kincaid sat in the corner near the stove, a tin cup of tea in her gnarled hands, looking as if she had been there for hours. She had. When the storm had torn the roof from her chicken coop and the coal had begun to win its war against her stove, she had done what she had done for 40 years. She had assessed her options with brutal honesty, chosen the one most likely to keep her alive, and acted. She had walked 2 miles through the storm alone at 68, following the hillside until she found the tunnel entrance. She had not asked Beulah's permission to enter. She had simply walked in, sat down, and started heating water. "Drainage channel is holding up," she said to Beulah by way of greeting, as if 7 people sheltering underground from a killing blizzard was the most ordinary thing in the world. That night, the chamber was full in a way it had never been designed for. 7 people in a space built for one. The youngest boy coughing in Verna's arms. The older girl asleep on a pile of blankets. Nolan sitting cross-legged near the passage entrance, keeping watch over nothing in particular. Althea in her corner, silent, immovable, radiating the particular calm of a woman who had outlasted everything the world had thrown at her and intended to outlast this too. Harmon sat against the wall opposite Beulah, as far from her as the small space allowed. He had not spoken since they arrived. Verna had thanked Beulah, quietly touching her arm with a tenderness that Harmon could not bring himself to offer. The children had been fed. The stove was ticking softly, its iron belly glowing. It was past midnight when Harmon spoke. "I found the journal," he said. His voice was low, directed at the stove rather than at Beulah. "Grandfather's journal. Nolan took it, but I knew it was missing. I found it in his room and I read it." Beulah waited. "The old man wrote about this hill, about the root cellar, about the warmth underground." Harmon paused. "I read it when I was a boy, 14, 15, same age as Nolan. I showed it to my father and he said the old man had gone soft in his last years, imagining things. So I put it away and forgot it." He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. The boy coughed and settled. "Jasper read it too," Harmon continued. "Years later, he came to me all excited, talking about the hill, talking about potential, about what grandfather had found. I told him the same thing my father told me, that the old man was senile, that there was nothing in that hill but rock." He finally looked at Beulah. In the low light, his face was not the face she had seen on all those previous visits, the face of authority and certainty and contempt. It was the face of a man who was looking backward through his own life and seeing for the first time the shape of his own ignorance. "3 generations," he said. "Grandfather knew, Jasper knew, you knew, and I stood in the middle and called all of you crazy." Beulah held his gaze. She did not say that he was right to feel ashamed. She did not say that she forgave him. She was not ready for either of those things, and he had not yet done anything to earn them. What she said was, "You are here now, Harmon. Your family is warm. That is what matters tonight." He nodded once. Then he closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the stone wall, and slept. The storm raged for 2 more days. Inside the chamber, time moved differently. There was no sunrise or sunset, no visual marker of the hours passing. There was only the rhythm of the stove being fed, the kettle being boiled, the meals being cooked and shared. Althea took charge of rationing the food with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing scarcity for 4 decades. Verna kept the children calm with stories told in a low, steady voice. Nolan maintained the fire and cleared condensation from the vent with a rag tied to a stick. Harmon worked. Without being asked, without discussion, he examined the walls of the chamber and the passage section by section with the eye of a man who understood construction. He found 3 places where the stonework had shifted slightly under the vibration of the storm, and he reseated the stones, driving the spikes deeper, wedging smaller pieces into the gaps. He worked quietly and methodically, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the stone. He did not call it an apology, but Beulah understood the language he was speaking, the only language he had ever been fluent in. He was fixing what needed fixing. That was how Harmon Whitmore said he was sorry. On the 7th day, the storm broke. Beulah knew it before anyone else because she felt the change in the air pressure through the ventilation shaft, a subtle easing, as if the earth itself had exhaled. She climbed through the passage into the cabin above, forced open the door against a wall of packed snow, and dug her way to the surface. The world was unrecognizable. The landscape had been remade in white, every feature buried, every landmark erased. The snow was higher than her head in the drifts and waist-deep in the open. The sun hung low in the southern sky, pale and hard, casting long blue shadows across a surface that glittered with a billion crystals of ice. The air was still viciously cold, but the wind had stopped, and in that stillness, the world was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She stood in the snow and breathed. The air tasted of nothing at all. When the village emerged from its shelters and began to count its losses, the reckoning was severe. 2 people dead. Ed Combs, who had lived alone in a line shack on the Patterson Ranch, found frozen in his chair, with his hand reaching toward an empty wood box. And old Marta Jensen, 81, whose heart had given out on the 2nd night when her stovepipe collapsed. Dozens of livestock dead. Hundreds of pipes burst roofs, collapsed fences, obliterated. The town looked like it had been through a war, which in a sense it had. And then the story began to circulate. It started small, the way all stories do. Someone mentioned to someone else that Harmon Whitmore, whose stone chimney had famously collapsed, had survived the storm, not in his own substantial farmhouse, but in a hole in the ground on his dead brother's worthless property. At first, no one believed it. Harmon Whitmore, the most practical man in the county, sheltering in his crazy sister-in-law's tunnel. It sounded like the setup to a joke. But then Emmett Hadley made the journey out to Beulah's land. He went alone on snowshoes, carrying a sack of provisions she had not asked for. She met him at the tunnel entrance and led him inside. Emmett stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, his eyes moving across the walls, the ceiling, the stove, the ventilation shaft. He ran his hand along the fitted stonework. He knelt and examined the drainage channel. He pressed his palm flat against the wall and held it there for a long time, feeling the temperature of the stone, the absolute absence of the cold that was raging just a few feet above his head. He did not say it was remarkable. He did not say he was impressed. Emmett Hadley was not built for such declarations. What he said when he finally spoke was, "This is sound work." Coming from Emmett, those 3 words carried more weight than a monument. He went back to town and described what he had seen, and this time his voice held a note that the people of Burrow Creek, had never heard from him before, something approaching reverence. And because Emmett was a man whose word was as reliable as the sunrise, the mockery stopped. The whispers of Mole Woman faded like frost in sunlight, replaced by a new name spoken with a different intonation: the Hill Woman. Harmon did not return immediately. He took his family home, repaired his chimney, restocked his wood. He did not speak of what had happened underground. When people asked, he said only that his sister-in-law had provided shelter, and his tone made it clear that further questions were not welcome. But 1 month after the storm, he came back to Beulah's property. He came on foot carrying his own tools, a mason's hammer, a cold chisel, a square, and a level. He did not knock on the cabin door. He went directly to the tunnel entrance and began to work. For 3 days, he reinforced her passage. He reseated stones that had shifted. He widened a section near the cabin's entrance where the ceiling was dangerously low. He added support stones at 2 points where he judged the load bearing to be insufficient. He worked in silence with the focused precision of a man performing an act of penance that he did not know how to put into words. On the third afternoon, when he was finished, he found Beulah at the entrance. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Inside was $200 in worn bills. "Not for the land," he said quickly, "for the debt, the wood, the food, the shelter, for my family." Beulah looked at the money, then at him. She took $50 from the envelope and handed the rest back. "That is the price you offered me for the land," she said. "Back when it was worthless. I will take that. You keep the rest and fix your chimney properly this time." Something moved across Harmon's face. It was too quick and too complicated to be called a smile, but it lived in the same territory. He took the envelope, put it in his coat, picked up his tools, and walked away down the snowy path. He did not look back, but his shoulders, which had been rigid and squared against the world for as long as Beulah had known him, had settled into a different posture, something less guarded, something that acknowledged in the language of the body that the world contained things he did not understand, and that this was acceptable. He never spoke of the tunnel again in public, but every winter after that, in the last week before the first hard frost, a wagon load of seasoned firewood appeared at the entrance to Beulah's passage. No note, no visit, just the wood stacked neatly and the tracks of a wagon heading south. Pastor Stanhope delivered his first sermon after the storm on a Sunday when the church was packed with survivors who were still counting their blessings and their losses in equal measure. He spoke about preparation, about faith, about the mysterious workings of providence. Near the end, he paused, adjusted his spectacles, and said something that surprised everyone in the pews. "Sometimes," he said, "the Lord hides wisdom in the places we are least inclined to look, in the ground beneath our feet, in the people we have dismissed. It is not our place to decide where wisdom lives. It is our place to recognize it when we find it, however late." Harmon sat in the front pew with his family. He stared straight ahead. He did not look at his hands. In the months that followed, Beulah's property became something it had never been before: a destination. Farmers whose root cellars had failed during the storm came to see her chamber and ask questions. Young couples planning to build new homesteads came to study her methods. They brought notebooks and pencils. They measured the passage, the chamber, the chimney. They asked about stone selection, about drainage, about ventilation. Beulah answered every question with the patient thoroughness of a woman who understood that knowledge, unlike money, increased when you gave it away. The design that emerged from these consultations became known locally as the Whitmore Passage. It was not a single invention, but a principle. A small subterranean room dug into a hillside or below grade, connected to the main dwelling by an insulated stone-lined tunnel designed to serve as emergency shelter or winter storage. It was simple, It was inexpensive. It used materials that were available on every property in the foothills: stone, earth, iron, and labor. It required no special knowledge that a reasonably intelligent person could not learn by doing. It required only the willingness to dig. Nolan Whitmore grew up to become the finest stonemason in the county. He learned his trade not from his father but from his aunt, in the dark by candlelight on his hands and knees. By the time he was 20, he had built Whitmore passages for a dozen families in the valley. By 30, he had modified the design for flat land properties, using excavated earth berms as insulation. He married a school teacher from Helena and built their home with a passage that his children use as a playroom in winter, a cool retreat in summer, and a root cellar in autumn. He never talked much about the winter of the Great Storm, but he kept his grandfather's journal on the shelf above his drafting table, and sometimes when a new client was hesitating over the cost or the effort, he would open it to the page with the old man's drawing of the root cellar, with its single-word notation, and let the client read it for themselves. Althea Kincaid lived another 12 years after the storm, an accomplishment she attributed not to any particular virtue but to simple stubbornness and the fact that she had no intention of giving anyone the satisfaction of delivering her eulogy. In her final winter, when her bones had grown too brittle for the stairs and her hands too stiff to split kindling, she moved into the chamber that Nolan had built beneath her ranch house, a faithful reproduction of Beulah's original design. She died in her sleep on a February night when the temperature outside was 30 below, but the air around her bed was 52 degrees and still. Her neighbor found her the next morning, lying peacefully under a quilt, her face relaxed, her hands folded. The stove was still warm. Beulah herself lived out her remaining decades on the property that had once been called worthless in the hill that had once been called a pile of useless rock. She expanded the chamber twice, adding a second room for storage and a small alcove that served as a library for the books that Emmett brought her from town, one or two at a time, without ever being asked. She never remarried. She never moved to town. She never became wealthy or famous or anything that the world would recognize as successful. But she was warm. She was safe. And she had proven something that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid learning: that the loudest voice in the room is not always the wisest, and that the person everyone agrees is a fool may be the only one who sees the truth. The cabin and the passage stood for generations after her. The structure became a local landmark visited by school children on field trips and by engineers from the state university who came to study the thermal properties of underground construction and left shaking their heads at the precision of work done by a widow with a pickaxe and a candle. The site was eventually placed on the county historical register with a small brass plaque that read, "The Whitmore Passage, built 1897 by Beulah Whitmore," a monument not to a battle won, but to a battle wisely avoided. But the real monument was not the stones or the passage or the plaque. It was the story itself, told and retold around kitchen tables and pot-bellied stoves throughout the valley, passed from grandparents to grandchildren, like a piece of worn currency that gains value with each exchange. The story of a woman who was given nothing and built everything, who was called a fool and proved to be the only wise person in the county, who did not fight the winter because she understood that the winter always wins, but who found beneath the frozen surface of the world a quiet place where the winter could not reach. The earth has a deep breath. It breathes out cool in the summer and breathes out warm in the winter. You just have to know how to listen for it. And sometimes listening requires getting on your hands and knees in the dark with nothing but a candle and a chisel and the stubborn, unreasonable, magnificent refusal to quit. Sometimes the deepest truths are not found by looking up at the sky where the answers seem obvious and the wind shouts its certainties for all to hear. Sometimes they are found by looking down into the quiet, patient, enduring earth, where the warmth has been waiting all along for someone brave enough or desperate enough to dig.